My undergraduate thesis was related to the research I was doing with Frank Soroff when I was an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota. And I sort of carried that germ along with me. What is the importance of money in politics? How does money matter to politics? Are donors somehow subverting American democracy? And I'd written a number of very specific, very narrow, focused articles on particular parts of that question. And the Journal of Economic Perspectives came to me and asked me if I would be interested in writing an article where we stepped back and thought about money in politics in a broader sense, in a broader way. And in particular, they asked a question that had long been held among economists, which is, what explains how much money there is in the system? And that was an opportunity for us to sit back and think about the magnitude and the scale of the amount of money and what that meant about the interest group system in the United States generally, the influence of corporations in particular, and of higher income people in the United States. Why is there so little money in American politics? It seems when you read the newspapers that there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money in this campaign or that campaign, that politicians spend all their time raising money, that corporations buy influence, state legislature and the federal government. But if we think about politics from a different perspective, from the perspective of an economist, we start to ask questions a different way. We start to ask questions about how much value there is in the amount of money, how much could a market possibly sustain. And viewing politics from that direction led us to think about a very simple question, which is, how much money is there really in the US political system, and what's the baseline for understanding that? And it's a very simple calculation. Take the total amount of money that's spent on all federal races that comes from all donors and normalize that by the size of the US economy or the size of the US government. And it turns out to be a very small amount of money, fractions of a percent. Small enough that if you put this into the national accounts, this would be rounding error on the national accounts. And that raises a very deep question, which is, given how small that amount of money is, how could it be that money would be subverting the democratic process or buying a great deal of goods worth value to the firms who, in particular, but also other interest groups that are contributing money? So in order to answer the question, why is there so little or so much money in US politics, because we didn't really have a judgment one way or the other when we started this, we started with a very simple calculation, what we did is we took the standard analysis that is often the beginning of most projects in this area. Take the total amount of money and deflate it. The deflation usually is by the consumer price index, which is how much can you buy with the money. But we were interested in a slightly different question, which was how much value could you get from those contributions. So we divided not by the consumer price deflator, but by the gross domestic product, or how much national income there is, to calculate how much money there was relative to the rest of the economy or the size of the government. And then we tracked that over time. So we collected from historical records and from current reporting from the federal government how much money there was, and we were able to go back to about 1900. And what we discovered when we did that was that the amount of money in politics relative to the past is roughly flat, or at least has been since about 1920, and that there was a precipitous decline at the beginning of the 20th century, probably coinciding with the decline of urban political machines and reforms in the campaign finance system at that time. Since the 1970s, social scientists have looked very closely at the relationship between campaign contributions and political decisions, especially inside the legislature, and what the effect of an additional $1,000, say, in contribution would be on the probability that the legislator would support a bill. We accumulated all the studies we could find, hundreds of studies, and extracted from those all of the estimates that were ever made of the marginal effect of another $1,000 on the probability the legislator supported a bill. And averaged those up, and we also studied the method to see if we could replicate that method on our own. And what we discovered when we aggregated all those studies was that in only a very small fraction of the cases did academics find any significant correlation between contributions and political behavior. We then tried to replicate the method from all those studies to see if maybe we were missing something, maybe the researchers had systematically buried something. And what we found was that in only about 10% of the cases do we find a significant effect. And in those cases, there were a few concentrated in some areas like agriculture, but in many of the areas where people thought this is an example of political influence from banks or the defense industry and so forth, we found virtually nothing going on of significance. When we did the magnitude of the estimate of the coefficient, even in places where we did find important results, were small. They indicated that the amount of favor or benefit that was being bought for $1 was relatively small on the margin. They were getting a little bit of value, not a lot of value. And therefore, we concluded from that that the amount of money was buying a little, perhaps, not a lot. And so the amount of money in politics was sort of modest for a very reasonable reason. It's very hard to influence politicians if you're a donor. Stepping back from that question, we also saw in what others had done and also gained knowledge from what the general social science research about elections and legislatures and representation tells us, and that is that legislators respond very much to their voters, to their districts. And they also respond to the influence of the party inside the legislature. And given those two forces, how much your voter matters and how much your party in the legislature matters, there just isn't a lot of room for a donor to come in and influence politics. And I think that's the reason why there's so little money in U.S. elections. They give only a little bit, and some of it is, there is some small incentive to get a little bit, so they give a little bit. If you were thinking about this as an economist, you're saying I'm going to spend some money to get a little bit of an investment, and I can invest it in this stock, say, or that stock. I might invest a little bit in that stock because it gives me a little bit of return, and a little bit in that stock because it gives me a little bit of return, but the only return you get is a little bit. So on the margin, you have lots of different things you can choose to invest in if you're a corporation. Politics is one of them. It depends on the area of influence, but mainly what they get from what most social scientists' research has indicated is some access. They get some information. They get the ability to go in the office and have a conversation, or one more conversation with a legislator. And what those conversations themselves get has been also researched for 50 years. And about half of those conversations are not of the form that most people, when they read newspaper articles, take away from those newspaper reports. The information they do get is, how will a regulation affect me? What regulations are coming? What's Congress going to do? Because corporations, like average citizens, are affected by the government, and they're just simply learning what the specific regulations are going to do to them and taking that information back home to their own CEOs and other managers to make smarter business decisions. So interest group politics in the United States takes many forms. There are many ways in which people can become active, many ways in which organizations are active in the United States political system. Money is one piece of that puzzle. It's a small piece of the puzzle. The kinds of activity that we see involving money sometimes involve getting a little bit of access, buying some support on the margin, but it's also a way in which people become involved. I talked to one corporate manager who told me how money raising works inside of his firm. And he said it's the job that nobody wants. None of the vice presidents want to run the political action committee. And there's a norm inside the corporation that you have to do something. You have to do something for the community. This is one thing you can do for the community. Become involved in politics help support the politicians who may have supported the firm's interests. But you can also give to the United Way. You can give to some other organization or charitable activity, but so long as you're involved. And I think in American society, in the organizations that make our communities work, there is a broad norm of becoming involved and participating. And much of the money we see involved in politics is relatively small, but it is of that form. It is people giving to be participatory, and that money being aggregated by firms and so forth and giving it to the politicians who support that firm. Whatever the legal implications are, we had a suspicion about what the effects of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act were going to be. We thought that by imposing those limitations, you'd really limit the influence of corporations in the United States, because that act put limits on sort of spending money outside of the normal limits. So we were able to monitor, as social scientists, what the effect of these restrictions were once that sort of money was prohibited on the valuations of the stocks. So if you thought that the money that corporations were putting into politics was really important to their bottom line, you would have seen investors react to their stock values in a certain way as soon as those restrictions were put in place. There was no effect. The stock market values of those firms were unaffected compared to the stock market values of every other firm in the United States who was publicly traded and who was not giving money. So the donors looked like the non-donors. Then when McConnell v. FEC came along, everybody thought that the restrictions were going to be turned out, who were on one side, and everybody who was fighting on the other side thought they would not be affected. So we could see whether or not the case law made any difference. And now we're 10 years later looking at a new case, which is Citizens United, which is taking away those restrictions 10 years later, and we can evaluate the valuations of the firm's stocks yet again. And what we're seeing currently is no effect on firms who donate lots of money or who were involved in what was called soft money on their stock market valuations of these decisions, which is a common way that economists will approach, or business researchers will approach a problem like this, called event study analysis. And those events, those big changes in laws, big changes in court rulings, have not had any appreciable effect on the value of the firms that donate money. Well, in some ways, I'd say calm down, because if American democracy can be subverted by $3 billion or $300 million, then it's not a very strong democracy. We think that the democracy is much more deeply rooted in our culture, in our history, and in ways that are not easily overturned by a relatively small amount of money. If it only took $3 billion to undercut all of American democracy, then most firms could do that on their own without any other activity of any other firm. A firm like Microsoft is worth tens of billions of dollars in terms of just straight up profits each year. So any firm like that, Walmart, Microsoft, take any major firm, has much more money that they could invest in subvert democracy if that was really what was going on. The amounts here are just too small to credibly believe that campaign finance undercuts American democracy. Well, I think political science research is much more relevant than the discipline itself gives it itself credit for. We do a lot of research in the field, working for campaigns, media outlets like CBS and others. I help call elections on election night for CBS. Me and other scholars working on various projects have contributed directly to shaping federal law and things like the Help America Vote Act. And periodically we're pulled into politics as professionals. Sometimes it's at the federal level, sometimes it's at the state level, but many of my colleagues are very involved in local politics, and one of the things that they all do routinely is use what they learn from political science to figure out how to help people in the community resolve issues, come to decisions, make better public policies. When I was an undergraduate, I really loved politics. I worked on political campaigns, but I also discovered social sciences, took classes in economics, sociology, political science, and I really liked political science, and I got an undergraduate research job summer after my freshman year working for Frank Soroff, and he just taught me how to do research, and I really loved it. It was something that sort of felt natural and just kept going. It was the path of least resistance. I also took some very good courses at the time, and they just got me progressively more interested, and it seemed less arid than economics. It's a little more real. And the one funny story is I talked to my grandmother, my Amachi, who's Basque, and I said, "So Amachi, I'm majoring in economics and political science." She says, "I know what politics is. What's economics?" I figured if I couldn't explain economics to my grandmother, it's not the direction to go in.